Back in 2021 I made a video about sewing a waistcoat, and I've been meaning to make a new video in which I sew one using a more reasonable fabric, because that one was made with... So this one should be a more useful video and definitely a more wearable waistcoat. I'm making this one out of a silk brocade that I've had in my stash for a few years. Normally with silk what happens is I go, ooh, it's too nice to use, and then I put it in a drawer. And sometimes I make it into a garment and then I go, ooh, it's too nice to wear. And I put it in my closet and then suddenly it's 7 years and a major surgery later and it doesn't fit me anymore and I've worn it maybe 10 times ever, which is sad. So this waistcoat is for my everyday wardrobe, and I'm not trying to make it perfectly historically accurate, but most of the construction is by hand just because I think it's nicer that way. For the main fabric, I'm using a brown and gold silk obi that I bought very cheaply in 2019 from a shop that unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. It's very crisp and heavy, and has a pattern of ovals with 4 different creatures in them. They're so small that I can't really tell what all of them are, but I think there's a phoenix and a dragon in there. The gold parts have a few metallic threads mixed in with the silk, so it's a little bit sparkly. It may not be the most ideal fabric for a late 18th century waistcoat, but I think it's at least vaguely appropriate from a distance. I've already made a later style of waistcoat using this fabric, way back in 2020, but like the green waistcoat, it needs to have the sides let out. For the front lining, I'm using a straw-colored silk satin, which is the lining from a different obi. It's a bit thicker than one might normally choose for a waistcoat lining, but still much thinner than the brocade. I have some bigger pieces of heavy brown linen that I could use for the back, but I'm going to patchwork it out of scraps because I want to. Linen tends to stretch, so rather than line the back in the stiff gold silk, I'm using a lighter weight brown linen from Pure Linen Envy. For the heavy interfacing, I'm using this buckram I made by stiffening linen with glue, and for the lighter weight interfacing, I have some stiff, tightly woven cotton, which is the interlining from a different obi. My pattern is this late 1770s to early 80s style one that I have used quite a few times now. I called it 1770s in the Werther's video, but I think the fabric I used for this one pushes it a bit more towards early 80s. I do my drafting on brown paper, but it gets a bit scruffy after a lot of uses, so this is my sturdier copy made from a nice thick laminated poster. I made the first version of this pattern so long ago that I don't remember what sources I used, so here I will just mention 2 of my favorite reference books. The Cut of Men's Clothes has a lot of pattern diagrams that I found very useful, but it doesn't really have much construction information. You can find it online as a free PDF, which is good because it's long out of print and very expensive, and I probably would not have this copy if I hadn't been gifted it. Costume Close-Up also has some pattern diagrams and much more construction information, which really helped me get better at 18th century tailoring. Just under half the patterns are menswear, and it's got a much narrower date range, but it's definitely worth getting a copy. I started with the back. After pressing an assortment of heavy linen scraps, I began laying them on the pattern piece to decide which ones I wanted to use. I sewed 2 together using a relatively small stitch length, pressed the seam open, and then did that several more times. Since the linen is a bit shifty and stretchy, I did my best to keep things on grain. I carefully trimmed the edges before sewing, so the seams would be straighter and so I could get the grain to line up. For these pieces, I wanted to join all 3 corners together. I marked dots on the corners to show where to stop, so I would have roughly even seam allowances, and then sewed the first pair. I'm using the dark brown cotton quilting thread that I bought for the Leaf Bolero video. I ran the other pairs I had pinned through the machine too, so as to be efficient. Then I lined up the corner of the 3rd piece and pinned it. Sewed it on, pressed the seam, and checked to make sure that those last 2 edges were overlapping just as much as 2 seam allowances. When starting these seams, I approached the corner from about 1 centimeter away, then pivoted so I could turn around and do the rest of the seam. It worked very nicely and the corners all lined up smoothly. Now that I had some larger pieces, I could trim and sew them together too. To add a third piece in between two pieces I'd already sewn, it was mostly the same as before, except I had to go back and add some backstitching to the end of that first seam. I made sure the scrap was big enough to fill out that corner of the pattern piece, cut everything so the angles lined up, and it went together very smoothly. Both halves came together fairly quickly, after which I traced my pattern piece onto them with fabric pencil and cut them out. Then I pressed my fine brown linen and cut out the back lining. The creases in the gold silk did not want to press out, but that's okay, it's just the lining. I cut out the front and pocket flap linings, and then to be extra fancy, I cut out the pocket bags in silk too. I set aside the silk lining scraps for later because I'm going to be doing the piecing method around the buttonholes. I pressed the brocade on a slightly lower setting because I wasn't sure if the metallic thread was in danger of melting. Thankfully the creases were much less visible in this fabric. Most obi silk is only half this wide, but this one's a maru obi, so it's just one big piece of brocade folded in half and I don't have to piece anything. The creatures are in 2 alternating rows, and I wanted to make sure the pattern was at the same height on both front pieces. You can see the differences on the back of the fabric too, so I carefully lined up the bottom corners with the same row. Here I'm marking my pocket opening and where the corners of the pocket flaps will go. I then lined up the corners of the actual pocket flap with the same part of the pattern repeat and cut everything out with about 1 centimeter of seam allowance, except for the side and shoulder seams where I added a little bit more. I'm usually not super precise with seam allowances because they aren't part of my pattern, so my tracing line is my stitching line. I ironed the creases out of my buckram with a press cloth to avoid gunking up my iron. I'm cutting buckram for the pocket flaps, a wide strip for the left front edge where the buttonholes will go, and a slightly narrower strip for the button side. These get cut out with no seam allowance. And then a piece of the lighter weight stiff cotton to add a bit more structure to the bottom. I wanted it to end just a bit above the upper curve of the pocket flap, so it'll add some extra stability where the pocket flap is attached. I cut it with pinking shears along the top, which is not necessary at all with such a thick outer fabric, but on a thinner one it helps the interfacing not leave an obvious line on the outside. As mentioned, I'm sewing most of this waistcoat by hand, so we'll do the last 3 machine seams now. I'm sewing up the pocket bags and the center back of the lining. On the back seam I stop at the top of the vent, and on the pockets I'm only sewing to the corners. I actually sewed a bit too far up on the pocket bags, and had to unpick the top later. Then I set those pieces aside and got to work on the fronts. I like to start with the pocket flaps. They're small and easy and you can get them out of the way quickly. I lined up my buckram and pinned it down. I tied a knot in another piece of that brown cotton thread and anchored it with a few stitches. I tacked the buckram in place all along the edge, taking small stitches from the backside so that only the tiniest little bit shows on the right side. I'm doing them about 1 centimeter apart, but you can put them a bit farther apart if you want to. The seam allowances were sticking out too far in some places, especially the pointy corners, so I trimmed them down a little. I also clipped diagonally along the inward curves, so they would press in more smoothly. This brocade creases very nicely and it was easy to press all the edges in, except for the pointy corners, which were more annoying. They had to be a bit blunt and squarish because the fabric is so thick. Then I pinned the lining on in the middle so it would stay in place, clipped the inward curves and trimmed the corners as before, and started folding the edges in. I want the edge of the lining to be about 1 millimeter or 2 further in than the outer edge of the brocade, so none of it shows on the outside. After pinning half the edges, I started sewing it on with a small felling stitch. Then once I'd gone around that first half, I pinned and sewed the second half. I do it one half at a time so I don't have to adjust the second half after I've sewn the first side down, because it might not sit quite the same after sewing as it did with pinning, and I want it to be nice and smooth. The pointy corners are so thick I had to stab stitch around them, but I still made very small stitches on the outside that don't really show on the fabric. Then I tied off the thread and buried it under the lining, and the pocket flaps were all finished. Now it was time to move on to the main part of the fronts. This is the left side where the buttonholes will go, so it gets the wider strip of buckram. I'm tacking it on just like I did with the pocket flaps, using the same brown cotton thread. Once I'd finished tacking down the outer edge, I finished off my thread and did the inner edge from the same starting point, just because it's easier to hold it in my hand that way. and then attach the right side one. I need to cut the extra material out of the pocket hole in the stiff cotton before pinning it onto the front, because I don't want that bulk there in the final pocket. I also don't want it to stick out too much over the top of the buckram layer, so I trimmed it down to have just a little bit of overlap. Since filming this, I have gone back and made a pattern piece for it, so I don't have to trace the bottom of the front pattern and cut it down. I tacked around the bottom edge while holding it, just like I did on the pocket flap, but the top edge is too far in to hold, so for the rest I sewed with it flat on the table. It's a bit trickier taking very small stitches when you can't feel it with your fingertip. After doing the outside edges, I sewed around the pocket opening, and now there was just the button stand left to add. I cut a strip of lightweight linen buckram, which I then folded in half lengthwise and tacked onto the lower half of the button side. This is to reinforce the locations of the buttons that will get the most strain. As you will see later in the video, I put this way too close to the edge, and it should have been 5 or 6 millimeters further in. I cut open the pocket holes, clipping all the inner corners. I clipped the seam allowances on all the inner curves, just like I did on the pocket flaps. I also made one clip into the seam allowance at the top of the side vent, and trimmed down some of the corners that had a bit too much extra fabric. I carefully pressed in all the edges, except for the ones that will be part of the side and shoulder seams. Then I gave the whole thing a press using a silk organza press cloth. Now it was time to put the pocket bags in. Quick note about the pocket bags, which I'm sure I filmed, but I can't seem to find the footage. Originally I'd sewed them all the way to this top corner here, but then I went back and picked out the top 8 millimeters or so, because for this lower part of the pocket, I want to fold it down so that it's even with the bottom part of the pocket opening, not the top. So I went back and picked that part out on the brown waistcoat pocket and notched it on the pattern, so I will remember next time. This is a totally different waistcoat, which I am not filming, but I'll probably do a blog post on it when it's done. Back to the brown one. I lined up the corners of the pocket bag to the ends of the opening and traced the lower edge on the front half of the bag with a mark to show where the center point was. I trimmed that edge and clipped into the mark so I could press those edges down. Then I lined them up with the lower edge of the pocket opening and pinned them on. The seam allowances are very narrow at the ends of the pocket opening, so I did a lot of small stab stitches on the ends to cover up the scruffy bits and keep it more secure. Then I joined those two lower edges with a whip stitch. After stabbing my way around the other end of the opening, I pinned the top edge and sewed it on with a whip stitch too. Then gave the pocket area another press, to smooth out anything that may have gotten scrunched up in my hand. I laid the pattern back onto the fronts to mark the corners of the pocket flap. I lined up the pocket flap as precisely as I could with the pattern on the fabric, which was a little bit off from where I'd marked the corners. I carefully pinned the pocket flaps down by their linings, since going through all the layers would cause too much warping. Then I basted them on with old cotton thread so they would stay in place while I sewed. I stabbed straight up and down with the basting thread, so as not to shift them. This is easier to do right at the edge of the table. To attach the pocket flap, I'm still using that brown cotton thread, lightly waxed, but this time I'm doubling it so it'll be stronger. The seam starts and finishes a little over a centimeter below the corner. This is to help the flap sit smoothly against the waistcoat and not flip up. I'm bringing the needle up through the fabric right next to the flap and down again through just a little bit of the edge. In a softer, thinner fabric, I'd be able to whip stitch it the same way I did the top of the pocket bag, but not with this stuff. When I got to the very pointy upper corner, I realized it was extremely thick and would make a terrible lump if sewn down. So I decided to unpick that little corner of lining and trim it off. This made it much less bulky, and it's such a tight space that all the raw edges are still well contained. With the whole thing still unlined, it's easy to tie off the thread on the back. I pulled out the basting and gave things a little more pressing. Now it's time for buttons and buttonholes. On the other waistcoat I made from this fabric, I did death's head buttons, but since the purpose of this waistcoat is to trick myself into wearing silk more often, I decided plain old cloth-covered buttons would be best because they'll hold up to more long-term wear. I'm using 1.5 centimeter wooden molds and I'm doing 9 buttons. I made a little donut-shaped pattern for my button covers so I could more easily center the design. The creatures are in ovals that don't fit very neatly in the circle, so I decided the diamond shapes in between them would be better. I have a separate video about cloth-covered buttons, so I won't go into too much detail here, but I'm just folding in the very narrow seam allowances and gathering the little circles around the wooden molds. Unfortunately, this fabric is so thick and so stiff that the linen thread I started with wasn't strong enough and it broke, so I had to switch to heavy-duty polyester. I was able to squish the gathers in more tightly by spraying water on them, which softened up the fabric a bit. And then I sewed all those lumps together and tied off the thread. The diamonds didn't come out perfectly centered on all of them, and I tried to shift those ones more into place, but the fabric was just too stiff. Once those were all covered, I started on the buttonholes. Since I have 9 buttons, I'm using this strip of paper that I've already marked out with 9 evenly spaced notches. I have several for this pattern. The materials are quite stiff and the buttons quite chunky, so I made my buttonholes 3 centimeters long, and I'm putting them about 13 millimeters in from the edge. With such a regular woven pattern, it's easy to draw them on the grain line. Like the covered buttons, I also have a video just about buttonholes, where I go into a lot more detail and discuss multiple options, plus how I measure and space them out, so both of those will be linked in the description. I'm doing a running stitch around my marked lines, cutting them open with a buttonhole cutter, and overcasting the cut edges with a whip stitch. Then I gave the fronts another quick press and, briefly pausing on the buttonholes, started whip stitching down the seam allowances. With some fabrics, like wools, I do this on every single edge I've pressed in, including the pocket flaps and around the pocket holes, but this stuff is so good at holding a crease that I'm only doing it on the interfaced areas, where I don't want the layers shifting around. I'm sewing through the interfacing and trying not to catch too many threads of the outer fabric. I could have done this step earlier, but I didn't want to accidentally cut through any of the threads while opening the buttonholes. Now that the buttonholes are cut and overcast but not sewn, it's the best time to mark the button locations through the holes, so they're all just the right distance apart. I can't quite get the pencil all the way to the ends of the buttonholes, so afterwards I drew them a little further out, so they're also about 13 millimeters from the edge. The only dark brown buttonhole twist I had was this small vintage spool. It matched my fabric perfectly, but I wasn't sure if there would be enough. I unwound and measured it and found I had 6.9 meters, which would give me only 76 centimeters for each of my 9 buttonholes. That's about 15 centimeters less than I would normally cut for a buttonhole of this length. I cut one length just to try it and was delighted to find that it worked. The tail was very short by the end, but not enough to make it difficult, and I didn't even have to get stingy with the spacing. Thicker buttonholes would eat up the thread a lot faster and this wouldn't have been possible, but thankfully this fabric is so tightly woven that I was able to make these ones very thin. I cut my remaining twist into 8 equal pieces. I'm waxing the very tip of my thread and anchoring it with a few stab stitches, doing closely spaced buttonhole stitches along both edges, and making bar tacks at both ends. Once again, there's a more thorough description of all of this in my buttonhole video. At the end it was easier to stick the needle all the way through first and then put it through the resulting loop, rather than wrapping around the needle as I normally do, but there was still enough of a tail left to finish off the thread without too much trouble. After finishing all the buttonholes, it needed another press, because holding onto it for that long had warped it again. Piecing the lining around the buttonholes is the most tedious way to finish them, but it's also the nicest way. I cut 8 little rectangles of lining as wide as the spaces between buttonholes, plus a little seam allowance. The top 2 have to be a bit slanted on the ends. I fold 3 of the edges in, but not the one furthest from the center front because it'll be covered up. On the pocket flap linings, I used the brown cotton to sew it down, but I decided I wanted the thread to match better here, so I switched to an ivory colored silk. I doubled it because the fabric is pretty heavy, and I also waxed it slightly, even though I know that can cause a bit of staining on light colored silks. I carefully felled the edge of the lining to the edge of the buttonhole, and to the front edge of the waistcoat, skipping a little space in between. Then added the next one and did the same, only now I can whip stitch the pieces together in that little part between the buttonhole and the front edge. The doubled thread got twisted a lot and I had to untangle it multiple times. Once those were done, it of course required another press. You can't skimp on pressing if you want things to look nice. Then I pinned the lining on, wrong sides together, and basted it, making sure to stay at least 2 centimeters in from the edges, and the same distance in from the buttonholes. I clipped into the side right at the top of the vent, the same way I did on the outer fabric, and cut around the buttonhole area, leaving enough seam allowance to turn under. I trimmed the other seam allowances down a little bit and clipped them where they had to curve inwards, and started felling the edges of the lining down as usual. Once I got to the inward end of the top buttonhole, I switched to using a spaced backstitch, which I did about 6 or 7 millimeters in from the folded edge. I don't know why, but the few pictures I've seen of this technique in extant waistcoats always do it this way, with the little flappy ridge there. I mean, they put the fold a little further out from the cut for some reason, but I don't want the ends fraying. The stitches don't go all the way through to the outside, they're just catching the lining pieces underneath, and maybe the buckram. Once I got to the bottom buttonhole, I continued as usual along the rest of the bottom edge. And did the same to the armhole. I used to put the linings on by laying the front piece down like this and then putting the lining on top of it and smoothing it out, but I would smooth it out too much and then the lining would end up too small and then it would sort of bend inward like that when I'd wear it. So in order to make sure the lining is the right size for the outside, it's better to lay down the lining first and then baste the front on top of it, like we did here. To sew the buttons on, I'm using the same heavy-duty polyester I used when covering them. I don't like polyester fabric, but if buttons are going to get a lot of wear, I do like to sew them on with thread that isn't going to break. That heavy linen thread I have is actually fine linen yarn meant for weaving, so it's not as strong as it would be if it was meant for sewing. I'm sewing back and forth several times between the back of the button and the waistcoat, leaving a few millimeters of slack, and wrapping the thread around it to form a shank. I'm bringing the thread straight over to the next location without cutting it, though I am tying it off. I then have to take a few stitches through the fabric and tie off the thread again before starting the next button, or else it would risk pulling the thread through and bunching up the front. When I got to the button stand, I realized I'd put it too close to the edge and it wouldn't do much to help the buttons because they were not lining up. Oops. I put the last few buttons on a bit closer to the edge. Then I pinned, basted, trimmed, clipped, and sewed the lining onto that side. When I run out of thread partway through doing the lining, I tie it off discreetly under the very edge, bury the tail, and start a new one. Using the loop from having double the thread instead of tying a knot makes the starting point less conspicuous. It's a little annoying doing the front edge with all the buttons in the way. Then of course both halves got another press. Now there's just the back to do. I sewed the center back seam by hand with a back stitch using heavy grey linen. I clipped the corners off all the patchwork seam allowances to reduce the bulk a little bit, and pressed it open, as well as pressing in the seam allowances on the center back vent. There was one very thick area in the patchwork seam allowance that I was afraid might not stay flat, so I tacked it down. The traced lines on the fronts are all covered up, so I lined up the pattern again and traced them onto the lining. All the stuff that's been done to the front pieces always distorts them a little bit, but I just line it up as best I can. Before sewing the back on properly, I always try it on to check the fit. I'm basting the side and shoulder seams with a running stitch. then gently pressing the seams so they'll lie flat. That's one of the advantages of having the fronts completely finished before sewing the back on. You can check the fit very accurately. It fit perfectly fine, aside from the right shoulder being ever so slightly rumpled, which it always is because my shoulders don't match. I've sewn up this waistcoat pattern quite a few times, but I always check to make sure. Now I can sew those seams more permanently with a back stitch. I had to stab stitch the ends because the layers of seam allowance were very thick and stiff. I sewed the tip of the aforementioned left shoulder seam a little further out from the basted line and removed that bit of basting after, but other than that I just sewed right along the basting line and left it in. And then pressed the seams more firmly so that all the seam allowances face towards the back. I find this easiest to do on a sleeve board. Then I clipped around the back armhole seam allowance and pressed it in. With linen you can crease along the marked line with a fingernail, which makes it easier to tell where to fold. I did the same to the back of the neck, and pressed the other 3 sides in on each of the lower back flaps. For the bottom, I made sure all the sides of the vents matched up in length rather than following the traced lines exactly. Now I just need to line the back. I always line up the center back seam first, starting on the bottom, so I can put the top of the lining vent just a millimeter or two above the vent in the outer fabric. I line it up carefully along the whole length and pin it, and then baste it down. Then I can smooth out the lining 1/2 at a time, and line up all the other edges. I fold them under and pin them, clipping the inward curves just as before, and then baste them down. That'll make it easier to handle since there won't be pins all over it. This is a bit easier to do on the corner of the ironing board than flat on the table. Another reason I'm basting it is so I can try it on again, just to make extra sure nothing is pulling or sagging before I actually sew the lining on. I don't always do that with back linings, but it is nice to be extra careful when I've put so much effort into the fronts. The lining can't be tighter than the outside fabric, but it also should not be loose enough to sag outside of it. I tried it on and it was fine, so I felled down all the remaining lining edges with more of that brown cotton. If I were going to leave the back unlined, which I often do, I would fell the center back seam and hem the bottom edges, and hem the armhole edges too. For the center back vent, you can fold them in on either side and clip them like I did for the shirt sleeve vent, but you can also fold this one to the outside so that both seam allowances are going in the same direction, and then that hem will just be on the outside, and that works just as well. I usually do it by hand, but for this one I did it by machine, and as long as the thread matches, it's perfectly fine. You should also put a little facing at the top of the back because just a hem is not strong enough for the back of the neck. And then the side and shoulder seam allowances just get pressed towards the back and felled down. Just trim the outer fabric back a bit and fold the lining in. And if you want to see actual footage, I do all of that in my Werther's waistcoat video. Then all that was left to do was 3 bar tacks, one at the top of each vent to reinforce the bottom of the seam. I'm using brown cotton pearl for the sides and beige for the center back. I take 3 or 4 big stitches right across the end of the seam, going through all the layers, and then do buttonhole stitches on top of them. I pulled out all the basting thread, and it was finished! Here it is, worn in a more historical way. And here it is in a more everyday sort of outfit. Overall, I am very happy with this waistcoat. I think it looks kind of fancy, but still drab enough that I'm not as worried about getting it dirty. And I have already worn it to work and to the grocery store, and nothing bad happened to it. Oh, I should mention quickly that I have added a new tier to my Patreon called Just the YouTube Stuff, which is cheaper than the tier that also has dinosaur comics. I do a monthly update post there about the sewing video stuff I've been working on, and I will occasionally post an unscripted behind-the-scenes video. That's more recent, so I've only got 3 of those videos, and the audio isn't quite as good because it's just the camera microphone so far, but I do still type out all the subtitles. Thank you, patrons, very, very much for helping me pay my bills. Anyways, yes, I think the waistcoat turned out good, except for the fact that I put the button stand too close to the edge, which was very foolish, especially considering how many of these I've made. But you can make dumb mistakes on anything, no matter how often you've done it. The patchwork is not the most visually interesting as patchwork goes, but I am happy to have used up some scraps, and happy to have used up some stash material that I've had for years. The one other tiny little complaint I have about this, and some other things I've made, is that when I use a really heavy polyester thread to sew on buttons, and then I tie it off on the back of the buckram, it leaves a hard little bump under the lining. I'm not too worried about it with this lining because it's quite thick, but when the lining is thinner, I worry that it might wear through more quickly in those spots. It certainly leaves quite a shiny mark when you go over that spot with an iron. I think the waistcoat colors are lovely and will go with a lot of things, although I don't actually have any coats that go with it because my wardrobe is severely lacking in coats. I have a lot of gaps in my wardrobe because I'm slow at making things, and because the more useful basics don't always hold my attention as well as the more fun experimental projects. But I recently realized that I have made 1 coat in the past 5 years, and that one doesn't even fit me anymore because it was really tight to begin with. I've made a lot of waistcoats and a few jackets and nothing to go over top of them, so that's something to work on. Dressing gowns don't count as coats. That's a dressing gown that's for indoors only. I am very pleased with how perfectly the buttonhole twist worked out, and with the pattern matching on the pocket flaps. The crease from the original fold never fully pressed out, so it's still there on the front edge, but it's not all that noticeable and I don't mind. The fabric is probably thicker than was usual for this kind of waistcoat because I had such a difficult time with the pointy little pocket flap corners, and they do not look as smooth as the accent ones. And the lining fabric is also really thick, but it all worked out fine, and I like really hefty silks. When a silk brocade feels like you could make a hiking backpack out of it, I think it's nice. Most of the obi silks I have in my stash are not quite that heavy, but still pretty thick. As mentioned, I got this particular obi from a shop that has since closed down, but I recently learned you can get them for very little money on eBay if you know where to look. This one cost me about as much as 4 liters of milk. They're usually 30 centimeters wide, but the length varies a lot depending on what kind they are. And so does the proportion of plain material to brocade. And for more specifics on that, I have a blog post with a whole bunch of measurements and observations about the ones I've got, so I will link that in the description. It's a very long blog post, and if you want small pieces of really nice heavy silk for not very much money, it should be useful. I even cut out that red waistcoat specifically for the blog post to get a better idea of how much fabric it would use up. And since I showed a clip of that one while talking about the pockets, I should show you the finished thing. Here it is, it's all done. And I also have a blog post about making it. The construction is mostly the same as the one in this video, but the cut is just a few decades earlier. For anyone wondering why I made a video about the small brown one instead of the big red one, this video was originally supposed to be about making a brown wool waistcoat. I used to have one that I wore all the time in the winter, but my posture has improved a lot and it didn't fit me anymore, and it was getting very worn out, so I gave it to a theater company. And I was just about to start making a replacement brown wool waistcoat when there was a little bit of a moth incident. Just one larva, and I only found a couple of holes in one pair of breeches in one box in my closet, but still very concerning. So I packed up all my wool in big bins and I put it outside to freeze for 2 weeks because it was still winter, and I cut this waistcoat out of silk instead. I could have used cotton, but like I said in the introduction, I do really want to get better at using my hoard of silk and actually wearing it, especially since a lot of my silk is secondhand and didn't cost me very much. So this was a plain wardrobe staple video that accidentally got more fancy, but I'm sure I will make more intentionally fancy waistcoat videos at some point. Thank you for watching, thank you again to my patrons for all your support, and go clean your iron if it's gunky. Get some iron cleaner. Bye.